They came with flashing lights, barking orders for me to get on the ground. But that wasn't how this story began. Long before the sirens, before the lawsuits and the headlines, there was only a red barn, a gravel road, and a promise I made to my wife. Peace. My name's Ethan Miles. I'm the Attorney General of Texas. Though most mornings out here, I'm just a man with a shovel and a bucket of feed. This is how a patch of quiet land turned into a battlefield, over fences, pride, and the law itself. The morning that started it all was the kind of dawn that tricks you into believing the world is gentle. The Texas wind moved slow and dry across the pasture, carrying the scent of mesquite wood and fresh hay. Our old red barn glowed faintly in the first strip of gold sunlight, and the frost on the grass crunched beneath my boots as I stepped outside. For a few long breaths, everything I saw, the cattle still drowsy near the fence line, the sunflowers Hannah planted bowing under dew, looked exactly like the peace I'd promised her when we left the city. I pulled on my frayed denim jacket, the one that's carried me through more winters than I care to count, and pushed open the porch door. The boards creaked beneath my weight, a sound I'd come to prefer over the polished floors of my old office in Austin. Behind me, the coffee pot had just begun to hiss on its timer, and I could hear Hannah turning in her sleep, still wrapped in the quilt her mother made years ago. I thought about the decades behind me, courtrooms, political storms, handshakes I never trusted, and how I'd traded all that noise for 45 acres of soil, livestock, and the slow honesty of sunrise. I told myself, out here, nobody cares who I used to be. That was the first lie I didn't know I was telling. The hens were already fussing at the gate, impatient for their feed. I scattered the grain, watched the roosters strut around my boots as if they were kings of Texas. There was a kind of healing in that routine, the scrape of the metal scoop against the bucket, the soft thud of kernels hitting the dirt, work that didn't need lawyers or headlines, just a steady hand. I was halfway through filling the trough when I heard it, a low, distant rumble drifting from the gravel road beyond our gate. I looked up and saw a pair of headlights sitting still in the mist, engine idling. Nothing unusual, I told myself. Ranch roads see plenty of trucks pulling over for directions. But this one lingered long enough to make me notice. I lifted a hand in a neighborly wave. The vehicle rolled off without a signal, slow at first, then disappeared behind the cottonwoods as though it had been caught doing something it shouldn't. 2 nights earlier, Hannah had told me she'd heard the faint buzz of a drone outside near dusk. I'd laughed it off, told her it was probably a kid from town testing a new toy. But standing there that morning, with the feed bucket in my hand, I caught a fleeting glint of metal above the tree line, something hovering just long enough to be seen, then darting away. A man who spent his life reading court filings and hunting liars learns not to ignore eyes that don't belong. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, Hannah stepped out to join me, a mug of coffee warming her palms. Her robe fluttered in the breeze, and for a moment, the worry in her face softened under the light. "Don't forget the north fence," she said, her voice still carrying the hush of morning. "The wind's been rough on it." I nodded and promised to check it after breakfast, but she stayed there a heartbeat longer, her gaze drifting toward the road where the car had been. "Ethan, do you ever feel like somebody's watching us out here?" she asked quietly. I laughed to reassure her, a sound that felt lighter than I truly felt, and said, "Out here? It's just the deer keeping an eye on us." She smiled at that, but the question lingered in the air long after we went inside. Late that morning, as I headed toward the north fence, I spotted a plain white envelope wedged between the slats of our front gate. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in thick black marker, E. Miles. Inside was a folded notice stamped with a gold ink seal that read, "Oak Hollow Community Enforcement Division, courtesy citation." The letter claimed I was in violation of visual compliance standards, that our red barn disrupted the neutral palette of the neighborhood. I chuckled under my breath. The barn had stood there for decades before Oak Hollow even existed, tossed the paper onto the passenger seat of my pickup, and went back to the fence work. But as I walked away, I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. Whoever had slipped that notice through my gate had already crossed a line without knocking. I chose to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing more than a fussy neighbor with too much time on their hands. Looking back, that thin piece of paper was the first warning shot. If I'd treated it as more than a nuisance, maybe the storm that followed wouldn't have hit us so hard, or so soon. That letter at the gate should have been the end of it. But 2 days later, I learned it was only the beginning. Trouble doesn't always knock loud. Sometimes it shows up in lipstick and a clipboard. 2 mornings after that strange envelope appeared, Hannah called me to the porch. A silver Lexus had stopped at our gate, dust swirling behind it. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, hair a sharp platinum blonde that caught the sunlight like polished steel. She walked with her chin lifted as if the gravel road was her private runway. In one hand, she carried a leather-bound folder. In the other, a pair of sunglasses she slid on with theatrical slowness. "Mr. Miles?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged like glass. "I'm Deborah Whitman, president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your non-compliance issues." I wiped my hands on my jeans, still dusty from the morning chores, and came down the steps. "My property isn't part of Oak Hollow," I said evenly. "Then I'm afraid you're mistaken about having any jurisdiction here." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Your red barn is visible from the main road of our community. It breaks the uniform color standard. We've sent notices." She tilted her head toward the pickup, where the old envelope still lay on the dashboard. "And we expect a timely correction." I almost laughed. "Ma'am, that barn's been red since before your subdivision had a single house. If it offends the neutral palate of your HOA, I suggest you plant taller hedges." Behind her, a man in a neatly pressed polo shirt shifted uncomfortably. Deborah introduced him as Ken Walters, her vice president, who nodded without meeting my eyes. Another figure lingered by the car, Sharon Mace, head of their so-called security committee, scribbling into a small notebook without saying a word. Hannah stepped out beside me, resting a hand on my arm. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Deborah's smile tightened. "Only if you refuse to cooperate." I kept my voice calm. "Unless you have a court order, you're trespassing. This is private land. I'd like you to leave now." Deborah's sunglasses slid back into place as if they were a shield. "You'll be hearing from our compliance division," she said, then turned on her heel. The Lexus spun up a trail of dust as it pulled away. For a while, Hannah and I just stood there listening to the fading engine. She sighed. "She's not going to let this go, is she?" "No," I said quietly, "and neither am I." That afternoon, 3 more letters arrived, each one thicker than the last. One fined me $500 for unregistered fencing. Another cited me $300 for improper livestock placement. The last was a notice threatening further action if I didn't repaint the barn within 10 days. I burned them in the fireplace after supper. Watching the flames curl around the gold seal felt better than it should have, but a small part of me wondered how far Deborah Whitman was willing to push. My years in politics had taught me that people drunk on small power rarely stop at the first glass. Over the next week, I noticed new habits around the ranch. A parked SUV across the road that never seemed to pick anyone up. Sharon Mace with her binoculars scribbling from behind the hedgerow. Even a couple of neighbors who slowed down just to take photos of the barn. Hannah caught one of them and waved. They sped off without a word. At night, the air still smelled of mesquite and hay. Yet the land no longer felt like it belonged entirely to us. I began to sense that the barn's red paint wasn't the real issue. It was about control, about someone trying to stretch a rule past the place it was meant to stop. I'd spent decades fighting over laws inside marble buildings. I never thought I'd have to fight the same battle over a fence post and a barn door. But the letters kept coming, and soon they wouldn't just send paper. The letters should have been the worst of it. But trouble has a way of testing the edges before it breaks through the gate, and soon enough, the paper turned into something else. It started with the little things a neighbor might shrug off at first. 2 days after I burned the last citation, I found a bright orange sticker slapped on our mailbox that read, "Pending violation," in block letters. No signature, no explanation. Hannah peeled it off, but that night, another sticker appeared on the back gate. Not long after, the buzz returned. The thin, mosquito-like hum of a drone. I was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee when I saw it hover just above the tree line. Its tiny red light blinked once, then steadied like a watchful eye. When I stepped off the porch, it zipped upward and vanished into the pale blue sky. Hannah grew uneasy. She started drawing the curtains earlier in the evening, muttering that she hated the feeling of being watched. I tried to reassure her, but I could feel it too. The air around the ranch had shifted, as if we were living inside someone else's rulebook. A week after Deborah's visit, I caught Sharon Mace, the HOA's so-called security chair, parked across the road. She had a pair of binoculars braced against her window and a small spiral notebook balanced on the steering wheel. When I stepped to the gate and raised a hand in greeting, she startled like a guilty child, dropped the binoculars, and drove off, tires spinning gravel behind her. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, turning a coffee cup slowly between my hands. "I don't think this is about the barn anymore," I said. Hannah looked up from her phone. "Then what is it about?" "Control," I answered. "A woman like Deborah doesn't like being told no. The barn's just an excuse." A few evenings later, an unmarked white SUV idled outside our fence line for nearly 20 minutes. No one got out, no one rolled down a window. When Hannah stepped onto the porch with her phone raised to take a picture, the SUV pulled away into the dark without headlights. The following morning, I received something new, a thick manila envelope in the mailbox stamped Community Enforcement Division, Final Notice. The paperwork inside accused me of unauthorized livestock placement and included a grainy black and white photo of my own cattle grazing near the creek. Someone had been close enough to take that picture at night. I sat back in my chair and stared at the photo for a long minute. That was when I realized this wasn't just neighborly complaints anymore. It was surveillance. I drove into town to speak with the county clerk about these so-called citations. The clerk, a man I'd known for years, flipped through the pages and frowned. "Ethan, these aren't worth the paper they're printed on. There's no such thing as a community enforcement division in this county." He leaned forward a bit, lowering his voice. "Oh, the Oak Hollow folks? Yeah, we get calls about them now and then. That Deborah Whitman runs that place like her own little kingdom." I thanked him and drove home slowly, the envelope on the passenger seat like a stone pressing down on my thoughts. It was one thing to wave binoculars from the roadside. It was another to forge an official seal and stalk a man's property at night. That evening, I set up 2 motion sensor lights along the driveway and checked the locks twice before bed. Hannah stood beside me as I tightened the last screw. "I came out here to grow sunflowers," she whispered. "Now I feel like we're living under siege." I didn't know what to say to that. All I could offer was a promise I hoped I could keep. No one crosses that gate without answering to me first. The signs were all there, the drones, the photos, the forged notices. I'd spent my life warning juries that small crimes grow teeth if you ignore them. I just didn't expect to learn that lesson again in my own backyard. I thought the worst they could do was harass us with paper and cameras. But that illusion ended one dusty Texas morning at dawn, when the sound of engines rolled up my driveway like a storm breaking over dry land. It was just past 7 on a Saturday. The sun hadn't yet burned the dew off the grass, and I was out near the barn scattering feed for the hens. The air smelled of grain and damp earth, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt all week. Then I heard it, the distant growl of more than one engine, heavy tires crunching gravel. At first I thought it might be a neighbor bringing hay, but the sound came fast, too fast for farm work. I turned toward the main road just as a black pickup swung off the gravel lane, followed by 2 faded Crown Victoria sedans, the kind old police cruisers used to be. All 3 vehicles barreled down my driveway in a plume of dust, red and blue lights flashing from dash-mounted bars. My heart kicked once in my chest, not from fear but from the shock of seeing my quiet ranch suddenly lit up like a crime scene. Hannah came running out onto the porch in her house shoes, shielding her eyes against the dust. "Ethan, what's happening?" I raised one hand to tell her to stay back. I wasn't sure yet what I was dealing with. The pickup skidded to a stop 10 yards from the barn. 3 men jumped out in black tactical vests stenciled with the words Community Enforcement Division. The letters tilted slightly, as if they'd been ironed on in a hurry. Their gear looked official at a glance. Holsters, radios clipped to their shoulders, even a pair of handcuffs dangling at one man's belt. But the longer I looked, the more it felt wrong. Mismatched boots, no county patches, no name tags. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered with a trimmed goatee, cupped a megaphone to his mouth. "Ethan Miles! Get on the ground with your hands behind your head. You're under arrest for violating community safety codes and resisting HOA jurisdiction." For a heartbeat, I just stared at him, the absurdity of the words catching in my throat. "Community safety codes?" I called back. "This is my land. What jurisdiction are you talking about?" The man advanced a step, his vest creaking as he moved. "This is your last warning. Comply." Now I slowly set the feed bucket down and raised my hands to shoulder height, not out of fear, but because I wanted Hannah to see I was calm. "Before you go another step," I said, "show me your warrant. And I hope it's signed by a real judge, not by your HOA president." Another of the men reached into a side pocket and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper. He waved it at me, but didn't step close enough for me to read it. Even from where I stood, I could see it lacked any seal or signature. I took my phone from my pocket, tapped the camera, and held it up. "You're being recorded live," I told them. "Under Texas Penal Code 37.12, impersonating a peace officer is a felony. You boys sure you want to keep playing cop on my land?" That got their attention. The one with the megaphone shifted uneasily, glancing at the pickup as though hoping someone else would speak for him. From the porch, Hannah's voice cut through the dust-filled air. "Ethan, should I call the sheriff?" "Already on it, sweetheart," I said without looking back. The tall man barked, "Put the phone down. This is an active compliance arrest." I couldn't help but laugh. "You've got flashing lights and loud voices, but no authority. You want me on the ground? You'd better bring the real badge." They started forward anyway, boots crunching on the gravel. I stayed put, feet planted in the dirt, my pulse steady, though the air between us had turned electric. The shortest of the three reached for his cuffs as if to grab my arm. And that's when the sound of another engine roared up the drive. A black SUV with the gold star of the county sheriff's office on the door swung in fast, tires spitting dust and pebbles. It skidded sideways to a halt between me and the fake cops. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Sheriff Luke Donovan, my old friend, boots hitting the dirt with the authority of a man who'd spent a lifetime keeping order. Luke's hand rested on his holstered sidearm as he strode forward. His voice was steady, but carried a weight that stopped men mid-stride. "Drop the cuffs." Now the man with the megaphone turned, startled. "Sir, this is HOA business." Luke raised his own badge high, close enough for the morning sun to glint off the metal. "Wrong county, wrong badge. You're trespassing and impersonating officers. Drop." The cuffs. For a long breath, nobody moved. Then the shortest man's bravado broke. The handcuffs clattered to the ground. Luke nodded once toward me. "You all right, Ethan?" "Better now," I answered, brushing dust off my sleeve. Behind Luke, Hannah finally lowered her phone, though she kept it pointed at the scene just in case. Her voice trembled only slightly when she said, "I hope you're recording all of this." Luke gave a small smile. "Dash cam's been rolling since I pulled in." He turned back to the three imposters. "On your knees, hands on your head. Dispatch, this is Donovan. I need 2 units at the Miles Ranch. 3 suspects in custody for impersonating law enforcement, possible unlawful detainment attempt." While Luke's deputies cuffed the men and led them to the cruiser, I noticed movement far down the road. A silver Lexus sat at the edge of the highway, engine running. Through the tinted window, I caught a glimpse of platinum blonde hair and dark sunglasses. Deborah Whitman. She didn't step out, didn't even flinch when our eyes met. Instead, she shifted the car into gear, turned, and drove off as calmly as if she were leaving a grocery store parking lot. I watched the dust from her tires settle back onto the road and felt a slow burn rise in my chest. The paper notices had been one thing. This was another. This was a line crossed, a neighbor's feud turned into an armed confrontation. Whatever game Deborah thought she was playing, it had just moved into my world, the world of real law. By the time Luke's deputies hauled the 3 men away, I knew we'd passed the point of neighborly disputes. Deborah had tested the gate, and now she'd kicked it wide open. That morning's standoff should have rattled me, but seeing the sheriff step out of that SUV felt like watching a storm finally break over a long, parched land. Luke Donovan wasn't just the law of this county, he was an old friend, and that made all the difference. After the imposters were loaded into the cruiser, the dust slowly settled across the driveway, like a curtain dropping at the end of a bad play. Luke stayed behind, one boot resting on the step of his SUV, his hat tilted low against the rising sun. For a moment, we just looked at each other the way men do when words aren't needed. "Been a long time since we stood on the same side of a line like that," he said finally, his voice as steady as it had been back in our early courtroom days. I smiled despite the weight in my chest. Didn't think retirement meant I'd be calling you out to chase off fake cops. Hannah came down the porch steps carrying 3 cups of steaming coffee on a tray. The tension in her shoulders had eased, but her eyes still flicked toward the road where the Lexus had been. Luke thanked her with a polite nod, wrapped his hands around the cup as though he were warming them, and studied the barn for a long moment. "She's behind this," he said at last. "Deborah Whitman. She might think she's clever, but she left fingerprints all over this stunt." I told him about the letters, the drone, the stickers on the gate, everything I'd ignored until the men with fake badges showed up that morning. Luke listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing the rim of the coffee cup as if he were cataloging each detail for evidence. "Good thing you didn't lose your temper," he said. "Most folks would have, seeing strangers in tactical vests shout at them on their own land. You stayed calm. That'll play in your favor." Hannah sat on the porch rail, arms crossed, her voice softer than usual. "Luke, I can handle rude letters, but today was different. I don't want to wake up every morning wondering who's parked out on the road." Luke's face softened. "You won't have to. I'll keep a patrol near your lane for the next few weeks. And Ethan," he looked at me, "don't underestimate Deborah. She's been running that HOA like a private fiefdom for years. But today she crossed the line from nuisance to crime, and that's where I come in." We stood in silence for a while, the only sound the low bawl of a calf from the far pasture. Luke finally set down the empty cup on the porch rail. "Dispatch is running the IDs on those 3 clowns. If any of them have priors for impersonating officers, the DA's going to love this case." I thanked him, but he just waved it off. "Ethan, you're not just another citizen filing a complaint. You're the Attorney General of this state. You know better than anyone how important it is to nail them on the right charges the first time." That hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent years in court arguing for the rule of law, yet it was my own land that had been violated under a fake banner of authority. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Before he left, Luke stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "I know Deborah. She won't take the humiliation of today lying down. She'll push back. Maybe not with fake cops again, but she'll find another angle. You be ready, I promised I would." Hannah handed him a paper bag with 2 of her fresh biscuits for the road, her way of saying thank you without words. He smiled, tipped his hat to her, and climbed back into the SUV. The hum of the engine faded down the road, leaving behind the smell of dust and diesel. Hannah slipped her hand into mine. "You trust him to keep us safe?" she asked. "As much as I trust anyone with a badge," I answered. But I couldn't shake Luke's warning. Standing there in the quiet that returned after the sheriff's departure, I looked over our fence lines and the red barn beyond. For the first time since we bought this ranch, I realized peace wasn't something the land could promise. It had to be defended, sometimes even from neighbors who pretended to be friends. Luke's visit gave me hope we weren't alone in this fight. But hope has a way of thinning out when pride and power start to crack. The real battle wasn't in the driveway that morning. It was waiting for us at the next HOA meeting. Luke's warning stayed with me. If Deborah was going to strike back, she'd do it where she felt most powerful, among her own people, in the bright lights of an HOA meeting. I figured it was time to look her in the eye. A week after the driveway standoff, a flyer appeared on our mailbox announcing an emergency HOA board meeting, open to residents. I wasn't a resident of Oak Hollow, but I suspected that didn't matter to Deborah. She wanted an audience, and I intended to give her one. That evening I put on a clean button-down shirt and my old court-ready boots. Hannah came along, more curious than eager, her arms folded tight against the cool night air as we parked at the Oak Hollow Community Center. From the outside, the place looked harmless enough. A low brick building with trimmed hedges and a row of lawn chairs lined up on the porch. But the moment we stepped inside, I could feel the tension in the air like the charge before a summer storm. Residents filled the folding chairs, murmuring among themselves. Some nodded at me in cautious recognition. Others looked away quickly as if siding with either me or Deborah might be dangerous. At the front of the room stood Deborah Whitman, dressed in a charcoal blazer with her platinum hair pinned into a perfect twist, the picture of control behind the podium. Beside her sat Ken Walters, shoulders hunched as though he'd rather be anywhere else, and Sharon Mace, notebook at the ready, her eyes sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses. Deborah struck the gavel against the table, a dramatic gesture for a neighborhood meeting, and the chatter died down. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice smooth and amplified by a small microphone. "We have a serious matter to address, a continuing violation that threatens the integrity of our community standards." I leaned back slightly in my chair, already knowing who she meant. "Mr. Ethan Miles," she continued, gesturing in my direction with a tilt of her head, "has repeatedly refused to comply with our regulations, despite numerous notices and a lawful compliance inspection." I stood up slowly, letting the chair scrape against the floor, not rudely, but enough to draw every eye in the room. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my tone calm, "you have no lawful authority over my land, and that so-called compliance inspection was a trespass by 3 men impersonating police. If you want to talk about violations, let's start there." A ripple of whispers passed through the audience. Deborah's smile faltered for a heartbeat before she regained it. "Mr. Miles, this meeting is not a courtroom." "Maybe it should be," I replied evenly, "because what you did was a crime." A man in the 3rd row, I later learned he was a homeowner named Frank, raised his hand timidly. "Is it true what he's saying, Mrs. Whitman?" "About the fake officers?" Deborah cleared her throat. "We engaged an external compliance team for safety purposes. Unfortunately, they may have overstepped." Ken Walters shifted in his seat, staring at the floor as though the tiles held the answer to every question. I caught his eye for a second. He looked away. The residents' murmurs grew louder, some voices rising in open frustration. "Where are our dues going?" "I never agreed to pay for that kind of thing." Hannah leaned closer and whispered, "Looks like the room's not all hers tonight." Deborah banged the gavel again, her voice sharpening. "Please, let's maintain order." The board acted in the best interest of the community. I took a step forward. "You call it the best interest. I call it harassment and impersonation of law enforcement, and I have the sheriff's report to prove it." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence said more than any argument could. Ken finally cleared his throat. "Maybe we should reconsider our approach," he muttered, barely audible. Deborah shot him a look that could have frozen running water. I decided to let the tension hang there and simply added, "I came tonight because I believe neighbors ought to face each other honestly." "You crossed a line, Deborah. This isn't about a barn anymore. It's about abuse of power." The gavel came down one last time, louder than before. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped. And just like that, the crowd began to scatter, conversations rising in uneasy tones as people filed out the door. As Hannah and I stepped into the cool night air, the cicadas were singing in the trees. She exhaled slowly. "You stirred the hive," she said. I nodded, watching Deborah through the glass door as she packed her papers in stiff, clipped motions. "Yeah," I answered, "but maybe the hive needed stirring." That night proved the neighborhood wasn't entirely on Deborah's side. I thought the storm might be settling, but instead, the fight was about to move into a different arena, the courtroom. That night's meeting didn't end the fight, it only lit the fuse. A week later, the battlefield shifted from folding chairs and gavel taps to the places I knew best: lawyers' offices, TV cameras, and city hall corridors. A few mornings after the heated HOA meeting, I drove into town to meet an old colleague, Sarah Keene, once a rising star in the state prosecutor's office, now running her own civil rights practice. Her office sat above a bakery that smelled of warm bread and cinnamon, an oddly comforting backdrop for what I was about to ask. Sarah still carried the same no-nonsense air I remembered: sharp blazer, hair pulled back, a pen clicking between her fingers as she listened. I laid the stack of forged citations on her desk along with the sheriff's incident report. When I finished explaining, she blew out a long breath. "Ethan, what they did isn't just harassment. You've got impersonation of officers, trespass, misuse of HOA funds, and that phony arrest order that edges into criminal conspiracy. That's why I'm here," I told her. "I want a restraining order against Deborah and her board, and I want this dragged into daylight." She gave a small smile. "Good. I'll draft the motions today. But if you go public, brace yourself. Reporters love stories of HOA wars. You ready to see your name on the evening news again?" I paused, thinking of Hannah and the quiet we had hoped to keep. "Public pressure may be the only way to stop her," I said at last. "Let them see what she's done." That same afternoon, Sarah filed the paperwork at the county courthouse. Luke, true to his word, provided the full body cam footage of the arrest along with statements from his deputies. By midweek, a local TV crew had picked up the story. Retired state attorney general targeted by HOA compliance squad. It didn't take long for the headline to spread. News vans idled outside our ranch gate, their antennas raised like steel sunflowers. Neighbors slowed their cars to snap photos with their phones. Some of the Oak Hollow residents I'd never met before began leaving anonymous notes of support in our mailbox. "We're on your side." We didn't vote for this. Deborah, on the other hand, doubled down. She held her own press appearance on the steps of the community center, flanked by Sharon and a very pale-looking Ken. Through a forced smile, she claimed the three imposters were independent contractors hired for public safety patrols and accused me of grandstanding for political points. Hannah watched the clip on the living room TV and shook her head. "She's spinning it like you're the villain," she said. I shrugged. People like Deborah always bet the crowd will believe the loudest voice. We'll answer with evidence. Meanwhile, Sarah's phones began ringing with requests for interviews. She advised me to choose one reputable outlet and tell the story clearly. We sat at her office late one evening, drafting a concise statement that the Oak Hollow Board had used homeowners' dues to stage an unlawful enforcement action against a non-member rancher, violating state statutes and endangering public safety. The next night I appeared on the 10 o'clock local news, jacket, tie, and my best courtroom voice. I kept my words measured. I moved to the ranch for peace, not for politics. But when anyone uses fake authority to threaten private citizens, it's my duty, retired or not, to stand up. The reaction surprised me. Messages of support poured in from nearby towns, other landowners with their own HOA horror stories, some even offering to testify about Deborah's heavy-handed tactics over the years. Luke stopped by a few days later, carrying a folder. "Thought you'd like to see this," he said, setting it on my porch table. Inside were preliminary findings from the county's financial audit of the Oak Hollow HOA. Unexplained cash withdrawals, missing receipts for external compliance expenses, and payments to a private security vendor that didn't legally exist. I whistled low. "Sarah's going to love this." Luke chuckled. "She already has a copy. She thinks she's got enough to argue for a full board injunction." Hannah joined us on the porch swing, listening as the wind stirred the sunflowers along the fence. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I just want them to stop coming after us. I don't care about headlines or politics. I just want to feel safe again." I squeezed her hand. "We're closer to that than you think. But we're not there yet." For a brief moment, I believed the law would be enough to tame Deborah's ambitions. I didn't know the fight was about to leave the courthouse paperwork behind and head into the shadows, where rules meant nothing and danger crept in after dark. The lawsuit was making progress in the daylight, but Deborah had no intention of playing fair once the cameras went home. I learned that lesson on a moonless Thursday night, when the lights on our ranch went dark without warning. That evening had started quietly enough. Hannah was in the kitchen frosting a lemon cake for Sunday church. I was on the porch, reading over a draft of Sarah's affidavit while the crickets chirped. The air smelled of cooling earth and the faint sweetness of mesquite smoke drifting from a neighbor's barbecue down the road. Then, without a flicker of warning, every bulb in the house blinked out. The porch light, the barn flood lamp, even the soft glow of Hannah's oven clock, all gone in an instant. The cicadas kept singing, but the silence inside the house felt heavier than the summer heat. Hannah came to the door, holding a flashlight. "Breaker's fine," she said. "Looks like the whole line's out." I reached for the old battery lantern and stepped into the yard. From the hill behind our barn, I could usually see the string of porch lights from Oak Hollow's cul-de-sacs twinkling in the distance. That night, their lights were still on, bright as Christmas. Only our stretch of the county road was dark. "That's no accident," I muttered. I phoned Luke. He answered on the first ring. "Already got 3 other calls from folks outside the HOA line," he said. "Looks like someone cut the service at the roadside transformer. We're sending a unit out. You two stay inside and keep the doors locked." I stayed on the porch until his cruiser headlights swept up the lane 20 minutes later. Luke climbed out, his deputy behind him carrying a toolbox and a portable floodlight. The deputy traced the line to the junction box and called over his shoulder. "Clean cut, Sheriff." "Looks like a bolt cutter job," Luke swore under his breath, then looked at me. "Sabotage. You can bet it ties back to your friends at the board, but there's something you ought to see before the power company patches this." From the passenger seat of his cruiser, he lifted out a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled flyer, damp from dew but still legible. HOA VIOLATOR DONOTAPPROACH. The photo was my driver's license picture, the same one Deborah's people had used on earlier notices. I felt a knot harden in my stomach. "This was on your windshield?" Luke asked. "No," I said. "I found one like it near the barn last week. Looks like they've been scattering them again." Hannah joined us on the porch steps, the flashlight beam trembling just slightly in her hand. "They're trying to turn the neighbors against us," she said softly. Luke nodded. "And tonight's blackout was meant to scare you." I was quiet for a moment, then said, "Luke, I think it's time we saw what they're hiding in that HOA office." His eyes met mine. "I was hoping you'd say that. We got a search warrant approved this afternoon, financial fraud tied to those external compliance expenses. I was gonna wait till morning, but after tonight's stunt, we go now." Within the hour, 2 cruisers and an unmarked county truck rolled into the parking lot of the Oak Hollow Community Center. The building stood in eerie contrast under the deputies' portable lights. A place usually reserved for bake sales and summer socials, now about to be treated like a crime scene. Luke and I entered side by side, while his deputies covered the doors. The smell of lemon polish floor wax mingled with the faint odor of overheated electronics, the servers still humming in the back office. A young deputy snapped photos as Luke broke the seal on a locked filing cabinet. Inside were manila folders bulging with receipts and handwritten notes. Some were marked in Deborah's unmistakable looping script: compliance patrol, cash payout, media monitoring, no receipt. Taped to one folder was a small USB drive in a labeled baggie. "Drone footage, east fence." Luke gave a low whistle. "She kept records, but not smart enough to hide them." I flipped through one stack and stopped at a spreadsheet printout listing payments to a company name I didn't recognize: Civic Solutions Enforcement LLC. A note in the margin read, "Use for next phase. Discreet." "Discreet," I muttered. "That explains the bolt cutters." The evidence was cataloged piece by piece: forged citations, maps of our property, even a checklist titled "Future Compliance Actions," with items like fence relocation, forced, and livestock penalties. By the time we stepped back into the cool night air, the power company truck had finished restoring the line to our ranch. Our porch light glowed again in the distance across the pasture, a small beacon against the dark hills. Hannah waited for us at the gate when we returned. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "More than I hoped," Luke replied grimly. I looked at the folder in my hands and then back toward the faint cluster of Oak Hollow street lamps down the road. "Tonight they cut our power," I said quietly. "Tomorrow we cut their excuses." The blackout had been meant to rattle us, but instead it handed Luke the proof he needed. We thought the fight might finally tilt in our favor, until a ghost from my past decided to step back into the picture. We thought the blackout was Deborah's last desperate move, but the real danger wasn't hiding in the HOA office at all. It came from an old name I hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, a man I once helped put behind bars. 2 days after the night raid on the community center, I woke to find an email in my inbox with no sender and no subject line. Only a small video file attached. The thumbnail showed a dark silhouette sitting in a car. I clicked it, and my stomach tightened at the sight of the face that filled the frame. Ronnie Chase. His grin was the same as I remembered from the courtroom years ago. Smug, wolfish, too sure of himself. He raised a pair of binoculars toward the camera as if to toast me. "You took my life once, Miles," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Now I'm taking yours. One piece at a time." The clip ended with him turning the camera to the night-lit outline of our barn, proof he had been close enough to taste the dust on our driveway. I sat there for a long moment, the blue glow of the laptop screen throwing shadows across the kitchen walls. Hannah stepped in with her coffee, saw my face, and set the mug down slowly. "What is it?" she asked. I turned the screen toward her. She brought a hand to her mouth the moment she saw the video. "That's him," she whispered. "He was right outside our fence." Luke came by within the hour after I called. He watched the video twice, jaw tight. "Ronnie Chase got out early on a technicality last year," he said. Figured he'd crawl back to his old tricks, but I didn't think he'd land here. I remembered Ronnie all too well, once a political fixer who had built his empire on bribery and extortion. A decade ago, I led the prosecution that put him away for 25 years. Apparently, the system had let him out in less than half that time. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside pulled me to the window. A gust of wind against the barn door, the distant crack of a branch. I sat on the porch with my rifle across my lap, Hannah wrapped in a blanket beside me. The stars stretched bright over the Texas sky, but the land felt smaller, as if the shadows themselves were creeping closer. At 4:17 a.m., one of the new motion sensor lights near the west gate blinked on. I froze, scanning the tree line. Something, or someone, darted behind the shed and out of sight. When I reached the gate, I found it slightly ajar, zip-tied to keep from swinging. A white envelope dangled from the tie. Inside was a single sheet of paper with neat block letters typed across the center. Nice cameras, but you still missed me. I'm closer than you think. Luke's deputies arrived minutes later, their flashlights cutting bright arcs across the pasture. They found no tracks, just the envelope. Luke muttered as he bagged it for evidence. He's taunting you, wants you on edge. The following day, Sarah drove out to the ranch. She laid a hand on the back of one porch chair as she spoke. If Ronnie's involved, this goes beyond Deborah. I'll contact the DOJ's organized crime unit and request protection orders. I nodded but didn't say much. I had dealt with threats before, angry politicians, lobbyists who lost court battles. But this felt different. Ronnie's threats weren't just about intimidation. They were personal, calculated, as if every move was a chess piece he'd been saving for years. That evening, Hannah set 2 cups of coffee on the porch rail and tried to lighten the mood. Remember when we moved here and thought the biggest problem would be coyotes stealing chicken feed? I managed to smile, but it didn't stay long. From where we sat, I could see the red barn doors still bearing faint scars from the hateful graffiti someone had sprayed weeks before. The night breeze carried the scent of cut hay and something else, the sense of being watched. I used to believe battles ended when the judge struck the gavel. Ronnie taught me that some grudges don't die with the verdict, and before long, his game would stop being silent warnings and turn into open violence. The threats stopped being whispers in the dark, and one gray dawn, violence finally came thundering down my driveway. It was a little after 6 in the morning when Hannah shook me awake. "There's a package on the porch," she said, her voice low and uneasy. I frowned. We hadn't ordered anything. Through the front window, I could see a plain brown box sitting neatly by the welcome mat. No label, no courier slip. A shiver crawled up my spine. I told Hannah to step back while I called Luke. His voice came sharp through the phone. "Don't touch it. We'll send the bomb squad right now." Within 20 minutes, the yard was lit by the flashing lights of sheriff's cruisers and the metallic hum of the bomb disposal robot as it rolled toward the package. Hannah stood beside me on the porch, her arms folded tight across her chest. I could feel her trembling even though the morning air was already warm. The robot's mechanical claw lifted the lid. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a deafening boom split the dawn. A plume of dirt and flame shot up at the edge of the pasture, echoing off the distant hills. The team had moved it far enough to spare the house, but the shockwave rattled our windows. Hannah gasped, covering her mouth. Luke hurried over, his hat clutched in one hand. "Whoever left that meant business," he said grimly. "We'll comb for fragments. Maybe we'll pull prints off what's left of the casing." I stared at the curling smoke beyond the fence and felt a cold anger settle in my chest. "This isn't HOA games anymore," I muttered. Luke nodded. "No, this is attempted murder." News crews swarmed the ranch before noon, their vans parked in a crooked line along the road. The headline scrolled across every local channel by evening. Former state attorney general targeted in failed bombing at rural ranch. That night, the sheriff's deputies doubled the patrol around our property, and Sarah arrived with a folder of emergency motions to tighten the restraining orders. Even as we signed the papers, Hannah's hands shook. "I just want to wake up one morning and not see blue lights on the fence," she said softly. I reached over, squeezed her hand. "We're going to end this," I told her. But in my gut, I knew we were standing on the edge of a deeper fight. 3 nights later, the violence came again, not wrapped in a box this time, but in spray-painted words. I was jolted awake by the frantic bawling of our cattle. Grabbing my rifle and a flashlight, I ran to the barn. The northern fence line had been slashed open, wooden posts hacked apart as if by an axe. In the beam of the flashlight, the red letters leapt off the barn door. "You won't win, Miles." The paint still dripped in long, dark streaks that looked almost like blood in the moonlight. Some of the cows had broken through the gap and were milling nervously near the creek. Hannah appeared behind me, clutching her robe, eyes wide. I motioned for her to stay back while I scanned the field. Luke's cruiser roared up the lane minutes later. He jumped out, barking orders to his deputies to secure the area and dust for prints. "Cutting fences, terrorizing livestock, arson threat on top of the bomb," he growled. "He's escalating, Ethan. This is no longer just intimidation. It's a pattern of domestic terror." I watched the barn door glisten under the flashlight beams and thought about Ronnie's promise in that first video. One piece at a time. He was keeping his word. The deputies worked till dawn, documenting the damage. Before they left, Luke pulled me aside. "I've already contacted the FBI field office. If Chase wants a war, he's going to get federal attention." That morning, I sat on the porch steps watching the sun rise behind the broken fence. Hannah brought me a cup of coffee but said nothing. The scent of smoke from the bomb's crater still lingered faintly in the breeze. I had spent a lifetime believing the law could protect good people if we built it strong enough. But sitting there with my wife beside me, I realized sometimes the law needs men and women willing to stand up and hold the line until justice can catch up. The attacks had reached their peak, a bomb at dawn, a threat scrawled in blood-red paint. But the battle was far from finished. The next move would shift from open violence to the courtroom, where truth itself would be on trial. When smoke still lingered over the pasture and red paint clung to the barn door, I realized the only way forward was to drag every shadow of this war into the light, and that meant stepping back into a courtroom, a place I thought I'd left behind for good. 2 weeks after the bombing attempt, the county courthouse in Oak Hollow was nearly unrecognizable. Satellite trucks lined the street outside. Reporters with microphones waited at the steps as if they were covering a governor's scandal. Inside, the main courtroom had been cleared for extra cameras, the jury box polished, the state flag freshly pressed and hanging behind the bench. Sarah met me in the hallway that morning, crisp navy suit and an armful of files. "You ready to be a witness instead of the prosecutor?" she asked with a quick smile. I nodded, though my stomach felt heavier than it ever had during my years at the bar. This wasn't just another case. It was my own life, my wife's safety, and the soul of a community we had tried to call home. The bailiff's voice rang out as the judge entered, and all of us rose. On the other side of the aisle sat Deborah Whitman, the once untouchable HOA president, her red lipstick subdued to a pale shade, her hair pulled into a tight bun that didn't hide the tremor in her fingers. Behind her sat the remnants of the old board, eyes downcast, and in a separate guarded row, shackled at the wrists, Ronnie Chase, wearing a faint smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Sarah's opening statement was calm but surgical. She laid out how an HOA board had crossed the line from neighborhood governance to criminal conspiracy, impersonating officers, using fraudulent fines, defaming a private citizen, even funding an act of domestic terror. When the sheriff's dash cam video played on the courtroom screen, showing the fake compliance arrest and Luke's badge check confrontation, you could hear a hush ripple across the gallery. Deborah's attorneys tried to object when the photos of the barn graffiti and the remnants of the bomb casing were introduced as exhibits, but the judge overruled them with a firm rap of the gavel. Luke took the stand next, giving his testimony in the same even tone he used at crime scenes. His words carried more weight than any speech. The evidence was simply undeniable. Then it was my turn. I stood, walked the familiar aisle to the witness stand, and for a heartbeat the years fell away. I felt again like the young prosecutor I once was, except this time the oath I swore was to tell the story of what had been done to me. I spoke about the letters, the phony citations, the night the fake officers came with their lights flashing, the flyers on my land, and the bomb that rattled our windows before sunrise. I turned my gaze toward Deborah as I said, "You tried to control me with fear. You thought fake power could silence a man who'd spent his life defending the law. But the law is bigger than you, and justice is louder than threats. Sarah finished by introducing the audit reports that traced HOA funds straight to Ronnie's P.O. box, along with the evidence bag containing the drone footage USB drive. The chain of proof was complete. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, the foreman rose and read the verdicts. Guilty on counts of conspiracy, fraud, defamation, endangerment for Deborah Whitman, guilty on charges of stalking, conspiracy to commit murder, and domestic terrorism for Ronnie Chase. The judge added an emergency order dissolving the Oak Hollow HOA under state statute for corruption and misuse of funds. Beside me, Hannah let out a quiet breath she seemed to have been holding for months. Luke gave a small nod from the second row, the closest thing to a smile I'd seen on him since spring. Outside, cameras flashed as we stepped down the courthouse steps. Sarah faced the microphones with professional grace, declaring, "This verdict is a message. Titles and committees cannot be used as weapons against private citizens. Justice belongs to everyone." For the first time in a long while, I believed her. That day in court felt like the storm had finally broken, but I'd lived long enough to know that storms leave debris behind. Even in victory, the work of mending what was broken had only just begun. The gavel had fallen, the cameras were gone, but life after a storm never slips quietly back into what it was. We learned that peace has to be rebuilt, plank by plank, handshake by handshake. The weeks after the verdict felt almost unreal. For the first time in months, our nights passed without patrol lights flickering on the fence line. Hannah planted sunflowers along the repaired north fence, their yellow faces turning to greet the Texas sun as if nothing had ever happened. I fixed the old tractor that had been sitting idle since spring, savoring the clang of tools and the smell of fresh oil on my hands. Sheriff Luke came by one Friday afternoon, carrying a bottle of bourbon and 2 chipped glasses. "Chase is already on his way to a federal max security facility up in Montana," he said as we sat on the porch steps. "Deborah got 15 years plus restitution. Guess that's the last we'll see of her red lipstick in this county." I raised my glass. "To the law still meaning something," I said. He clinked it with a rare half-smile. Sarah called the following week with news that the civil suit for damages had ruled in our favor. Over $1 million in compensation, most of it coming from seized HOA accounts and Deborah's personal assets. Hannah listened quietly on speakerphone, then simply said, "Maybe now we can breathe." But the moment that touched me most wasn't about money or verdicts. One early morning, I opened the mailbox to find a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single handwritten note. "I used to be afraid of my HOA. After watching what you did, I'm not anymore. Thank you." Beneath the message were 37 signatures, names of people I had never met, some from neighboring counties, a few from as far as Arizona and Oklahoma. It reminded me that this fight had rippled far beyond our pasture's fences. Late in the summer, Hannah suggested we repaint the barn door one last time. Neighbors came to help, folks who had once kept their distance during the worst of the conflict. Together we brushed over the old red scars and, at Hannah's idea, added a mural, a wooden gavel crushing a crooked HOA compliance badge underfoot. Above it, in bold white letters, we wrote, "You don't own me," and beneath it, "Property, justice, freedom." During Labor Day weekend, we hosted a small cookout under the wide oak by the creek. Families brought potato salad, peach pies, and lawn chairs. Children chased one another through the sprinkler spray while country music hummed from an old radio. For the first time in what felt like years, laughter echoed across our fields instead of sirens. At sunset, Luke wandered over with a plate of ribs and said quietly, "You know, Ethan, you stirred up a hornet's nest that reached farther than we thought. But you didn't just win in court. You gave a lot of regular folks the courage to push back." I looked out over the ranch, the mural on the barn glowing gold in the dying light. "I didn't stir it, Luke," I said. "I just smoked it out." When the last neighbors left and the crickets began their evening song, Hannah and I sat on the porch swing, watching the stars blink awake. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Promise me we can just have peace now. No more lawsuits, no more battles. Just sunflowers, quiet dinners, and growing old." Right here I took her hand in mine. "You have my word," I told her, and for once I felt I might be able to keep it. The fight had ended where it began. on the porch of a small Texas ranch. We had traded fear for freedom and silence for a story worth telling. And if there's one lesson I'd pass on, it's this. Never let anyone hide behind a title to steal your peace. Because sometimes the law wears a cowboy hat, and sometimes justice rides a tractor,